Okay, back for the third part of the international trade lecture. In this section, I want to talk a little bit about restrictions on trade, specifically tariffs, and probably in the next section we'll get into quotas. But let's go over some general restrictions on trade that countries use when they don't necessarily want more of other goods coming in. An embargo is a law that prohibits trade with another country. So, like for instance, we still here in the United States have an embargo against most of the things coming from North Korea and Cuba and even Iran. So a lot of people think that a couple years ago when President Obama was going to Cuba that all of a sudden the embargo went away. That is absolutely not true. There are still a lot of restrictions on what Americans can do in terms of trade with Cuba. And even though Trump visited North with Kim Jong Un the other day, we still have an embargo against trade with North Korea. So that's the most extreme restriction on trade. A tariff is a tax on imported goods, and that's the thing we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail now. An export tax isn't a restriction on trade per se, but it does have that effect. In other words, if a country decides that it's going to tax its exports, it makes its exports more expensive. Now, interestingly, the United States, before the income tax, at the federal level, got most of its money from export taxes. Back when the U.S. was an agricultural country and we were producing cotton and tobacco and things like that, most of the revenue that went to the federal government came in the form of export taxes on agricultural products. There's other what are called non-tariff barriers to trade. For instance, a quota. A quota in the context of trade is a numerical limitation on the amount of a good that can be imported from another country. So typically you find quotas on textiles. I mean, if you've ever gone shopping for, let's say, jeans, let's say you go somewhere, let's say you go to Macy's and you're going to buy 3 pairs of jeans and get out of the store, and you know what you're going in for. You know, you go right to the rack, you pick your size, your cut, everything. If you bother to look at the labels, you might see that, one pair of blue jeans came from Guatemala, another came from Honduras, and the third one came from Bangladesh, let's say. So then you might ask yourself, why didn't they make them all in the same country? It's because in textiles anyway, here in the U.S., there are a lot of quotas as to how much of, let's say, blue jeans or T-shirts or whatever can come from any one country. A voluntary, notice I put voluntary in quotes, a voluntary export restraint is when a country agrees to export less of a good to another country. So then the question is, why would a country agree to that? And the answer is because maybe the other country, if the country that they're trying to cut exports to, if they don't agree to that, then that country might impose some kind of a tariff. So they're doing it as a way of heading off a tariff or a quota being imposed on the producers that are exporting to this country. Then there's all kinds of other restrictions. Some countries have employed inspections. In fact, I was gonna talk about a something that happened back in the 1980s. One of the things I've heard is they're going to do the same thing in China. I forgot which good, but now that we're kind of getting in a trade war with China, the Chinese have said that they're going to inspect all imports of a certain product coming in, and they only have like 3 inspectors to do all the inspections on whatever this good is. And I don't even know that these guys know what the heck they're doing, but they're just it's sort of a way of slowing down trade. Or one of the complaints a lot of people in the US make when they try to get into another country is they find that it's not easy. There's all kinds of paperwork requirements. There's all kinds of requirements on the product. That having to, is it safe? I mean, you could have a product that's being sold safely here in the United States for decades, and they'll say, oh, but we have to test it for this, or we have to inspect it for that. So there's all kinds of different ways that countries restrict trade, we're mostly going to focus on tariffs and quotas. All right, so to start off our tariff discussion, imagine that we're going to be the importing country. How do we know we're the importing country? Because the pre-trade domestic price, the thing I'm calling PD, is higher than the world price. So we've got this big graph over here on the right that's supposed to show the US market. Imagine that even though this big graph, or even though this graph is bigger than the smaller graph showing the world market, the US market is maybe measured in millions and the world market is maybe measured in hundreds of millions. That's how we know that the world market is bigger than the domestic market. So if the price in the world market is PW, this country, let's say it's the US, is going to be an importer of the good. Why is that? Because PW is lower than PD. And so that means it would make more sense for this country to import the good than to export the good, right? Well, if the price is PW, how's that going to affect domestic producers and consumers? Producers are going to move from left to right up the supply curve until they get to PW. Remember, they can't get PD anymore because they're competing against imports. And you have to imagine that there are people in another country that will supply as much as any country can buy at a price of PW. So what we do when we get up to PW is we drop a line down to the quantity axis, and this is domestic quantity supplied. All right, what about in the US? What about consumers in the importing countries? Well, consumers are pretty happy. They used to pay PD, and now they can buy as much as they want at PW. So they will move down the demand curve, keep moving down until they get to PW. And then we can drop a line down to the quantity axis, and this is QDD. QDD stands for domestic quantity demanded. QDS stands for domestic quantity supplied. All right, so now imagine that we're just focusing on this domestic market where QDD is greater than QDS. You might think that there is a shortage. There's no shortage. The difference between domestic quantity demanded and domestic quantity supplied is imports. So now put yourself in the position of the producer of this good. Before, you used to get PD and you used to sell QD. Now you have to compete against these cheaper goods that are selling at a price of PW, and you're only able to sell QDS. So you've seen your market shrink. You're forced to cut your price. Your profits are probably going down as well. So what might you do? You might agitate for a tariff. Okay, you might try to get the ear of a congressman, or maybe how about getting a president elected that's sympathetic to your need to get a higher price. Maybe one that thinks that we shouldn't be importing as much as we are. That somehow that's bad for America, right? So imagine that you're able to get a tariff imposed on this good. And maybe realistically, there's no way that you can get a tariff high enough to bring the domestic price back up to PD, but you'd be happy to get a little bit of tariff relief. So imagine now the new price in the market with a tariff is PW plus T. Okay, well, how's that going to affect the market? Well, first, let's take a look at what happens at a price of PW. So at a price of PW, domestic producers move up the supply curve until they encounter PW. And like I said before, we drop a line down to the quantity axis, and this is domestic quantity supplied. What about consumers? Consumers move from left to right down the demand curve, and they keep going until they encounter PW. And so this is domestic quantity demanded. If a tariff is added to the cost of this good, it's going to move the price up to from PW up here to PW plus T. How is that going to affect domestic producers of the good? They're going to move up the supply curve. They're going to keep on going beyond PW over here until they get to PW plus T. So then what we do is we drop a line down to the quantity axis over here, and this is domestic quantity supplied with a tariff. That's what I mean by QDS, and then in brackets a tariff. Okay, so domestic producers are feeling good because now they've managed to supply more, and they're getting a higher price because this tariff only applies to imported goods. All right, what about domestic consumers? Well, most of the time domestic consumers don't even notice. I mean, if there's a tariff, let's say, I don't know, if there was a tariff of a nickel per sock on imported socks, you probably have no idea that you're paying it. But the price would be higher. So what we'd expect would happen would be that domestic quantity demanded with the tariff is going to go up. Maybe some people will notice the domestic quantity demanded would decrease somewhat, but it's not going to get people protesting in the streets. I mean, if you had to pay a nickel more, just imagine you have to pay a nickel more per sock, and you notice that when you go buy socks at Target or whatever. Yeah, you might be a little bit upset about that, but you're not going to try to organize people to protest against it. Okay, so what's the net impact? The net impact is that imports are going to be reduced. Remember, before the tariff, when the price was PW, the amount that was being imported was the difference between QDD, domestic quantity demanded, and QDS, domestic quantity supplied. Now that the price is PW plus T, the amount that's being imported is the difference between QDD with a tariff and QDS, with a tariff. So imports have gone down. Now what I want to do is take a look at what happens to the overall welfare. By welfare, we mean how well off people are in a country as a result of this tariff. So if we were looking at consumer surplus, we'd be looking at the area below the demand curve and above the price. So let's look at let's start off with PW as our price. Which of these areas represent consumer surplus if the price is PW? It turns out it would be 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6. All right, what about domestic producer surplus? So producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the price, and we're saying that PW is the price. So the only thing that looks like producer surplus in this case, if the price is PW, is 7. All right, so now imagine that a tariff is imposed on the market. This is designed to provide a little bit of relief, get a higher price for domestic producers. The price goes from PW to PW plus T. So then what does domestic consumer surplus look like now? Well, before it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now it's only 1 and 2, right? The definition of consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price. So it's just 1 and 2. What about domestic producer surplus? Well, now that the price is PW plus T, 3 and 7 are domestic producer surplus. So domestic producers picked up 3 threes to belong to domestic consumers. But domestic consumers not only lost 3, they lost 4, 5, and 6. So one of the things I'd like to do is try to account for these other areas, 4, 5, and 6. All right, so what is 5? 5 is tariff revenue. Tariff revenue, the reason we know it's tariff revenue is because if we multiply the tariff per unit, which is the difference between PW plus T and PW, right? If we subtract PW from PW plus T, we're left with T. So that would be the tariff per unit. If we multiply the tariff per unit times the new quantity that's being imported into the country after the tariff has been imposed, that's the difference between QDD with a tariff and QDS with a tariff. Then we'll get the total amount of tariff revenue. So, okay, that's pretty good. We've accounted for 1, 2, 3, 7, and 5. We still have 4, 5. We still have 4 and 6 to account for, right? 4 is a deadweight loss to the more efficient foreign producers. In other words, there's somebody in another country that is willing to supply as much as you care to buy at a price of PW, but he's been boxed out of the market because of this tariff. The government in the importing country has raised the price, and by raising the price, they've substituted the production of more inefficient domestic producers for the production of the more efficient foreign producer. Okay, what about 6? 6 is a deadweight loss to consumers. Why is that? Because if consumers could pay PW, they would buy QDD. But now consumers are forced to pay PW plus T, so they're only consuming QDD with a tariff. So this is a deadweight loss to consumers as a result of the government in the importing country imposing a tariff and raising the price. All right, so that's why, oops, that's why I show you this over here. This is just basically a summary of what happened to domestic consumer surplus and domestic producer surplus. So one of the things you'll notice is the gains to domestic producers, meaning three, that came from consumers is not as large as the loss to consumers, right? Because consumers still lost 4, 5, and 6, even once we've transferred 3 to producers from consumers. Does that make sense? So 5 is tariff revenue, and 4 and 6 are deadweight losses. I'm going to end it right here, and we'll come back and we will talk about a quota.